Welcome back to Real Takes, where we are all movie love all the time. I'm Ann Stott, and tonight we are shining all the movie love on Sidney Poitier. Now, I had decided to talk about Sidney Poitier tonight a few months ago when I was planning out the first few months of the year because it's his birthday this week and I love Sidney Poitier. I've been watching his movies since I was a child and I was really excited to talk about his work. But obviously now there's a sort of bittersweet quality to celebrating his films because he passed on in January. And I'm sad about it, but I think it makes it more important for us to talk about his work and celebrate his many, many achievements. So, Sidney Poitier was the biggest Black star of the second half of the golden age of Hollywood, so the 50s and the 60s. And there were other Black actors working in Hollywood: Harry Belafonte, Sammy Davis Jr., Lena Horne, Dorothy Dandridge, Pearl Bailey, all had roles in films. They were also all singers, so they had singing careers as well and sort of go back and forth between film and just touring or recording. But Sidney Poitier was a movie star, and he rose to another level of fame where he was consistently one of the main stars of a film, of a major motion picture. He got to a point where his name was above the title of the movie on the poster, which is a thing in Hollywood. And he was the first black actor to win an Oscar for a leading role in a film for his work in Lilies of the Field in the early 60s. So he, blazed a trail, and he has said that when he was starting out, there wasn't a path for what he wanted to do. He had to make it. And he did make it. Now, it was really interesting thinking about the movies for which he's most famous. And I realized that probably the first Sidney Poitier film I saw was To Sir with Love. And so I think of it as being the most famous of his films, but it's possible that that one's receded a little bit. I think Raisin in the Sun is definitely huge. I think Guess Who's Coming to Dinner is massive. And then people say that In the Heat of the Night is one of his most famous films, which is interesting to me because it's one of my all-time favorite films. And for a long time, I thought of it as lesser known. So I don't know if it's had a renaissance or if it was better known than I realized. I feel like I was always telling friends about it who didn't know anything about it. But I don't care how it's gotten better known. It's a fantastic film. We're going to talk about it a little bit tonight. People say that he really broke through with the film The Defiant Ones, co-starring Tony Curtis, about two prisoners who escape from jail and they're chained to each other. And that was definitely the movie that kind of sealed his career. But I want to go back a little before that and talk about a film called No Way Out, written and directed by Joseph Mankiewicz, who would also make little films like All About Eve and Cleopatra and The Barefoot Contessa. No Way Out was Sidney Poitier's first leading role in a major motion picture. And it's a crime drama about a newly certified Black doctor in a city hospital who treats two brothers who've been shot by the police while committing a crime. And they're white and they're racist. And one of them dies and the other one accuses Sidney Poitier of murder. And it's about all the tension that accusation calls up at the hospital and also in the city at large. Now, again, this was Sidney Poitier's first leading role in a major motion picture, but you can see all the talent, all the intelligence, all the timing, the presence, the grace, the authority is all there. It's a really strong performance from him. Richard Widmark plays the surviving racist brother, and apparently they really enjoyed working together. They made 2 more films together and had become friends, and it was really hard for Richard Widmark to play this role because he says a lot of very angry, racist things in the film. And I guess after a lot of takes, he would apologize to Sidney Poitier. This is a really tight crime film with this added layer of issues around racism. It was, like I said, written and directed by Joseph Mankiewicz. And one thing I want to point out about it that I think is really special is that in the film, there is Black community. Sidney Poitier is married. He lives with his brother and his sister-in-law and his mother. He has a friendly connection with Black workers at the hospital. None of them are doctors, but it's clear they have a certain understanding and connection. His brother is connected to a community of Black people. And, you know, people have talked extensively about the fact that the films that Sidney Poitier is most famous for, he's like the isolated, sainted, perfect Black man among a group of white people, sort of changing them single-handedly. And so it's really interesting that in one of his first films, he would have so much community around him. And I'll be honest, I don't know exactly how that came to be, but I think it's a real credit to the filmmakers and to Joseph Mankiewicz that he wasn't just an isolated doctor with no people around him, because I think that portrayal, whenever we have stories about a dominant culture and then someone from a marginalized part of that culture portrayed as isolated, the dominant culture doesn't see the whole picture, because those people always have community around them and support from other areas, and the whole story isn't being told. So there's a level of storytelling here that, or an element of storytelling that we don't see in a lot of the more famous Sidney Poitier films, which is one of the many reasons I like that movie. And he made this movie in 1950, and The Defiant Ones was a few years later, and then that would really kind of rocket him to stardom. Apparently, he turned down a lot of roles that he felt were just too demeaning, too racist, not good enough. So it took longer for him than it might have for a white counterpart to find his way into roles that he felt good about. But I am going to talk about In the Heat of the Night, even though people say it's one of his most famous pictures. And I like to talk about underseen films, but I love this film so much that I have to talk about it. In the Heat of the Night came out in 1967. It was directed by Norman Jewison, and it starred Sidney Poitier, Rod Steiger, and the force of nature that is Lee Grant. Now, this is a story of a lone Black police detective from Philadelphia who gets stuck in a small Mississippi town and is at first accused of committing a murder, and then when they find out he's a police detective and in fact a homicide detective, he's roped into investigating the murder. So in a way, this film is, this formula that Sidney Poitier was thrust into a lot, of being the lone Black man around a lot of racist white people and having to sort of survive their attacks, both overt and covert, with an unprecedented amount of grace and patience that no one should ever be forced to display. All right, jumping in here, there's so many ways to talk about this film, and you'll see I'm going to jump in and jump out and jump in and jump out and jump in on my jumping in, so be prepared. I guess what I'm thinking about is the fact that as a white person in the United States, it wasn't until I reached adulthood that I realized that almost all the films I'd seen about racism in America had been made by white people. And those films had often been made with the intent of making white people feel better about racism. So racism was bad, but now it's better. Racism is bad, but look at how much we can teach each other. Like these sort of pacifying messages that allow white people to leave the theater feeling okay about themselves and about racism. And I was 20, I think, when Do the Right Thing came out, which feels like a sort of before and after movie in the history of filmmaking about racism in the United States. And you know, in the 30-ish years that Black filmmakers have had more resources to tell the stories they want to tell, I'm not aware of a film where they've wanted to tell this story of like, oh, racism was bad, but look at the good white people who helped, or look at the ways that white people and Black people can work together harmoniously. Like, that isn't the story they've wanted to tell. So in terms of this channel, I've wanted to highlight films by Black filmmakers telling the stories they want to tell, rather than films by white filmmakers about racism. That said, we're celebrating Sidney Poitier, and we have to talk about films made by white people about racism because of the time in which she was working. Now, I've loved In the Heat of the Night for a long time because of its artistry and the acting, and I am a sucker for a film about two strong personalities who kind of come up against each other in any context. I love watching a kind of battle of the wills sort of story. But I have to, be honest and ask myself, is there some way I feel more comfortable with In the Heat of the Night because it's a film made by white people about racism, and I'm sitting with that. But I also think when you look at the span of filmmaking about racism through the 50s and 60s. In the 50s. Okay, jumping in. So one of the reasons this film is so interesting, I think, is because it was made in a moment of so much change in our country, right? So it's 1967. The civil rights movement is changing. The Black Power movement is coming into force. So the anti-war movement is taking off. The sort of counterculture movement is taking off. And then cinema is changing along with that, being influenced by European cinema, becoming grittier, more realistic, less melodramatic. So there's all this change happening. It's 1967 when the producer and the director and the writer started making this movie in 1965. They had to get a studio to back this film, even though it was understood that it would never be shown in a theater in the South at all, right? So that was a hard sell in 1965, and it wouldn't be shown in a theater in the South because it portrays racism more starkly than most of the movies that came before out of Hollywood studio systems. By the time the movie is made, a lot of culture in America has moved to a point where they want to see a different kind of story. And certainly mainstream Hollywood wasn't quite there yet. And honestly, to some extent, mainstream Hollywood hasn't caught up still, right? Right? I think what I'm coming around to is that, if so many films about racism have been made by white people who wanted to make a story that makes white people feel better, this is a story about racism made by white people who wanted to wake white people up. And so they're still using, more traditional storytelling methods to do that, and they're working within certain limitations. And yet the tone is different. The point of view is slightly different. And then, honestly, the depths of the racism that's portrayed is more realistic, not fully realistic, but more realistic than it had been. So because we're celebrating Sidney Poitier, I feel like I need to interject something I hadn't added, which is, so, in the film, they show white people from this town, Sparta, Mississippi, conspiring to kill Sidney Poitier, right? So this is like a level of animosity and hatred that wasn't necessarily shown a lot in mainstream Hollywood films. They shot the film in Southern Illinois, and Sidney Poitier didn't want to shoot the film in the South because he was known at that point as a civil rights leader. A cross had recently been burned on his lawn when his wife was home in Pleasantville, New York, by the way, not even the South. And so they shot in Southern Illinois, but there were a few scenes that Norman Jewison felt really strongly needed to be shot in the actual South. And he convinced Sidney Poitier to go to Tennessee or Kentucky to shoot these few scenes. It was going to take like 5 or 6 days. And they had to stop. They had to leave early because Sidney Poitier's life was in danger. They were getting harassed and trailed on the shoot, and Sidney Poitier was sleeping with a gun under his pillow. So that's just to bring home, the risks he took to make his work in general, the kind of animosity and danger he came up against on a regular basis while just trying to live his life and do what he was passionate about. And all respect and love to Sidney Poitier. Back to the video. And also the sense of limitations of the connection between Sidney Poitier's character and Rod Steiger's character, like the walls they come up against in their working relationship, and the acknowledgement that there's only so far Rod Steiger's character is going to go. And people disagree in writing about how happy the end is, and it's done in such a way that I think people can sort of project onto it what they think the filmmakers are trying to say, what their own feelings about it are. But I feel like there's so much integrity in the ways we're shown that these two people cannot walk into the sunset together holding hands. So the film was directed by Norman Jewison, who would go on to make Jesus Christ Superstar and maybe most famously Moonstruck. And it was shot by cinematographer Haskell Wexler. Now, this was his first film shooting in color, and he has said that he didn't really know how to light color, and there are a lot of decisions he would have made differently. But even within that, it's so beautifully shot. And then it was edited by Hal Ashby, who within a few years would start directing films himself, including Coming Home, Shampoo, and Being There in the 70s. So a lot of talent went into making this film from behind the camera. And then there's the acting, which is just so beautiful and committed. Rod Steiger and Sidney Poitier became friends, and they really liked working together. They just brought a lot of force to these scenes they had with each other. And then there's the incredible force of nature that is Lee Grant. I will say it again. And when Sidney Poitier passed last month, Lee Grant gave something to the Hollywood Reporter about Sidney Poitier. She said, "Sidney and I improvised that scene we had. It was one of those great experiences working with a guy who had that kind of empathy. His energy and his concentration just filled the room. He could be intense in the scene, and then when it was over, everything was delicious. Sidney was ahead of everybody. He had such a sense of power within himself and humor. He was grounded in his own freedom. He was urgent, and he was brilliant, and he was gorgeous. We shall not see his like again." And their scene is just a beautiful experience of nonverbal acting, and how two actors who are so present and connected to each other and listening to each other and committed to their character can kind of literally dance together. It's just beautiful, stunning work. So, and then there are these two moments that kind of are really famous, that have become kind of iconic cinema moments. And I won't say what they are for anyone who doesn't know, but some of you might even know the moments without knowing the film. And they're really, again, they're kind of a signpost in the shift in cinema making around race. There are two moments when Sidney Poitier gets to kind of claim his humanity and his dignity on a new level that maybe hadn't quite been true in past films, and helped open doors a little more to even claim more humanity that we'll explore in the next film. But wait, Wait, two more things. I could talk about this film forever. Okay, so the first thing is that In the Heat of the Night was one of Sidney Poitier's own favorites of all his films. So that gives me like even more love for it than I already had. And then the second thing is that in 1967, Sidney Poitier starred in 3 box office hits: To Serve with Love, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and In the Heat of the Night, even with no support from Southern audiences for In the Heat of the Night. And In the Heat of the Night won 5 Oscars, including Best Picture. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? Katharine Hepburn won an Oscar for her acting in that film. And Sidney Poitier was not nominated for a single Oscar for any of the films. So, star of 3 huge, critically acclaimed box office successes and no awards recognition. Ew. On to the next film. So we fast forward to a much less known film called Buck and the Preacher from 1972. And this is Sidney Poitier's directorial debut, which stars Sidney Poitier, Harry Belafonte, and Ruby Dee. And in this film, Sidney Poitier plays Buck, who's a cowboy that helps lead wagon trains of freed slaves across the West. And he's doing 2 things. He's helping them get to their destination, and he's also helping to protect them against bands of mercenary soldiers who were paid by Southern plantation owners to ride west, destroy all the property of the freed slaves, and make it impossible for them to settle in the West. So they would have to go back to the South and be exploited labor. So I just want to say that I did not know that little piece of history from the United States, that was one of the many things that happened after the Civil War that made it impossible for Black people to move forward and create truly free lives. So it's a very important story being told. It's a reclamation of the Western. It's the first Western directed by a Black man. He wasn't supposed to direct it. He and Harry Belafonte decided to make the movie, and they had hired someone else to direct who they agreed after the first week didn't have the focus on the material that they wanted. And so Sidney Poitier stepped in. Now, apparently he'd been wanting to direct for a while, but he didn't think he was ready yet. And then in this situation, he stepped in and went for it. And I'm fond of this movie for a bunch of reasons. One, that this story is getting told, that it's a reclamation of the Western, which is a film genre that has been used so irresponsibly to perpetuate so many terrible stereotypes. It shows a different kind of relationship with Native Americans. Now, unfortunately, there's some whitewashed casting with an Indian chief and his wife. So there is that problem. But the relationship between Sidney Poitier's character and the First Nations tribe that's in the movie is so different from what people had just been spoon-fed for decades from Hollywood films. So that's really exciting. And most exciting of all, we finally get to see Sidney Poitier kill some bad guys. And it is really satisfying. I hope it was satisfying for him. I was so psyched for him that he finally got to kill some bad guys. So I'm not going to tell you this is the best Western you've ever seen. There's a kind of uneven tone to it. There are comedic moments that feel a little out of place with the seriousness of the story. I don't fault anyone. You know, Sidney Poitier took over in the midst of shooting. It was his first film. The music is a little out of sync with what's happening or what we're supposed to feel. So there's a kind of tonal question about the film, but I really enjoy it. I find it totally satisfying. Also, Harry Belafonte plays a sort of con man preacher who forms an uneasy alliance with Sidney Poitier's character. And they're really good friends in life, and it's fun to see them work together. And Harry Belafonte is playing a little against type there. So I just really enjoy Buck and the Preacher. I love that it's the beginning of his directorial career. He would go on to direct, I think, 12 films. such as Uptown Saturday Night, but culminating with Stir Crazy in 1980 with Richard Pryor and Gene Wilder, which was a huge hit. And then he stopped acting for a while, but just as a bonus, if you want a really fun late career Sidney Poitier watch Sneakers with Robert Redford, Dan Aykroyd, David Strathairn, River Phoenix, and Mary McDonald, about a bunch of tech nerds who get hired out to test big corporation security systems. And it's so dated, but it's so clever that all this antiquated technology is sort of fun and almost cute now. But it's a really fun ride of a movie, and it's great to see Sidney Poitier in a later career film. So all love to Sidney Poitier. Tell me in the comments what you think his most popular film is, because I'm really curious what people's perceptions are of that. And tell me what your favorite Sidney Poitier film is. And I will see you next Wednesday. Thanks for watching Real Takes. Hit the subscribe button below so the algorithms will tell you when new episodes are out. And if you want to support Real Takes, please visit my Patreon page where you can join at any tier from $2 to $100 per thing I make. The $15 tier is specifically about supporting Real Takes, and you'll get behind the scenes information and be thanked in future videos. See you next Wednesday.